So I'd like to welcome everybody in person and also online to the 2025 Distinguished Lecture Spirit Discussion Talk by the Global Humanities and Religions Department. Our presenter this year is Rebecca Moore, who is Professor Emerita from the Department of Religious Studies at San Diego State University in San Diego, California. Professor Moore is a personal friend. It was a pleasure to invite her, and I'd like to share a little bit about her accomplishments, which are many. She holds a PhD from Marquette University. Previously, she earned master's degrees from Marquette and also American University, the latter in film. And my understanding is you actually had a career in television production before you returned to graduate school to do religion. Within the world of religious studies, Dr. Moore has 3 different research areas: history of Christianity, Jewish-Christian dialogue, and also new religious movements, which I would say is the element for which you are best known. Professor Moore's most recent book is People's Temple in Jonestown in the 21st Century on Cambridge University Press, 2022. But when I was looking at your bio this morning, I realized that you have more than a dozen books to your credit, and so I will not list them all here, but it was very impressive. Let me say that I've known you for a long time, and I've known your impressive work chronicling the events with People's Temple that ended in the tragedy at Jonestown, Guyana in 1978. But I also know you as the editor of the Elements series for New Religions on the Cambridge Press imprint. And also, I just discovered that you are co-director of the Women in World's Religions and Spirituality Project, WRSP, which is something to which I myself have contributed. And I didn't know you had a leadership position there. Last but not least, I won't belabor, you're the book review editor for Nova Religio. In other words, let me say that you have distinguished yourself in professional service in almost every venue from my research field. Since 2015, you have been resident of Friday Harbor. Washington State is our gain, California's loss. Welcome, Professor Moore.
Thank you very much, Holly. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm very pleased and honored to be speaking here at Western Washington University this afternoon. I'd like to thank the faculty and staff of the Department of Global Humanities and Religions, especially dear friend and colleague, Dr. Holly Folk, Professor and Department Chair, Dr. Andrea Grogroff, I knew I messed that up, and Department Manager, Maureen Chrisman. I deeply appreciate their time and efforts, as well as those working behind the scenes who are making this Zoom possible. And also, I don't know where the camera is aimed, but welcome to people in Zoom land. Let me start by asking, what comes to mind when we hear the word cult? Just shout out whatever. Brainwashing. What else? Dangerous, yeah.
Charismatic leaders.
Charismatic leaders.
Sexual abuse.
Sexual abuse. Thank you, Holly. Right. When I was practicing this, my husband would always say Kool-Aid. So, scholars of new religions have long sought to counter these popular perspectives with social scientific research. Although they've offered euphemisms for the word cult, new religious movement, alternative religion, minority religion, marginal religion, NRM, none has been able to replace the term. Research has demonstrated, however, that people have negative stereotypes about groups presumed to be cults. And even so-called cult experts admit the problematic nature of the word. In the 21st century, some have begun to replace the word cult with a term they think is less pejorative, that is, high-demand group. Moreover, new religions tend to become newsworthy primarily after provocative, bizarre, or violent events occur. Journalists themselves may be biased against new and alternative religions, or they may simply reflect cultural prejudices against them. I'll be using many different expressions this afternoon, but I hope you will remember that for scholars, cult is a 4-letter word. New religions fascinate and terrify people all around the world. They are titillating in large part because their very essence seems filled with deviant beliefs, perverse practices, and dangerous possibilities. This explains their ubiquitous presence in popular culture through movies, television series, podcasts, magazines, and YouTube. The genre might be true crime. It might be a docudrama. It might be a thriller, or even today, a comedy. Fictional television shows serve up sex and violence in cults with a side dish of criminal endeavors. Lurid investigative programs emphasize manipulation and exploitation, providing accounts by former members, law enforcement officials, and anti-cult experts. Given this reality, it is not surprising that an essentialist view of NRMs exists. Essentialism asserts that things, material objects, plants, animals, humans, groups, and so on, have an unchanging and intrinsic essence. In philosophy, the basic idea is that the essence causes and explains all the observable shared properties and allows us to draw inferences and formulate scientific laws about them. In other words, there are elements that define and characterize the essence of a particular item or kind. In this instance, new religions. For example, when an NRM leader commits pedophilia, this is viewed as typical cult behavior because cult leaders are essentially criminal perverts. When a Roman Catholic priest exhibits the same behavior, however, this is considered atypical, the actions of one bad apple, because priests are essentially beyond reproach. According to NRM scholar Catherine Wessinger, the cult essentialist outlook is an inaccurate stereotype in which people, including law enforcement agents and journalists, assume that all groups that have been labeled cult are the same. The harm such a view can cause seems self-evident. It was demonstrated in media and government assumptions about the Branch Davidians in Waco and about the Chen Tao group in Garland, Texas. Those groups were assumed to be suicide cults along the lines of the People's Temple community in Jonestown. Yet that was not the case for either group. In this talk, I want to challenge the essentialist perspective by arguing that eruptions of extreme violence are the exceptions rather than the rule for new and minority religions. These groups number in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands around the globe. They're overwhelmingly nonviolent and wish for nothing more than to follow their conscience in peace. Indeed, the greater threat of violence comes from state actors that seek to suppress religions they consider deviant, criminal, or treasonous. So tonight's agenda is going to start by defining violence, especially as it pertains to new religious movements. Since there's a difference between killing people, making them work hard, re-educating them, it's important to understand exactly what we mean by violence. I will then look at the canonical or archetypal cases of mass death that occurred in the late 20th century. These outbursts are anomalous rather than normative for new religious movements. I will consider fresh developments in the cult awareness movement, also known as the anti-cult movement, revealing its new strategies for addressing the fact that large-scale cult disasters are unusual and rare. The concept of spiritual abuse has supplanted the threat of cult violence, and theories of coercive persuasion have replaced brainwashing claims. Anti-cultists are using innovative legal strategies to combat cultic abuse, and I'm going to discuss these new strategies. I'd like to conclude with a discussion of the rise of state-sponsored oppression of new and minority religious groups. This is a move that threatens religious liberty internationally. And then, of course, we'll open it up for questions and discussion. I should state at the outset that my two sisters were involved in the People's Temple movement, which ended in the mass murders and suicides in Jonestown, Guyana in 1978. I was never part of the group, and most of my knowledge about it has been acquired since my sisters died. It's one of the reasons I entered the field of religious studies, and I'm interested in new religions. That experience undoubtedly shapes my views, although probably not in the ways that you might expect, as you will see. So, it's important to begin by defining what we mean by violence, not only in new religions, but in society as a whole. We also need to differentiate between types of violence. Certainly, homicide, physical assault, sexual violence, human trafficking, forced prostitution, and domestic violence are clear cases that most would agree are actions that harm the body, not to mention the soul and the mind. Other violent acts like suicide, killing in self-defense, and war may be considered justifiable depending upon the circumstances. Then there are nonviolent crimes such as extortion, fraud, manipulation, which may cause emotional or economic harm, but are not violent in the same way as acts of terror or physical brutality. Finally, there are actions that may be harmful or injurious: fasting, bodily mortification, extensive praying, chanting, but are believed to be salutary and even praiseworthy within a religious context. As an aside, as I was writing this, it occurs to me that the violence perpetrated by humans against animals is rarely included in any catalogs of harm done. Sociologist Mary Jackman acknowledges the difficulties in defining violence. She notes that some violence is unintended, such as certain practices tolerated by business owners. Some is perpetrated with good intentions, such as ritual sacrifices conducted in pre-modern societies. And some is practiced for enjoyment, such as bullfights, boxing matches, and action movies. Jackman does not differentiate or exclude instances that are justified on religious grounds, especially self-inflicted abuse, because even those acts fall under her generic definition of violence, which is actions that inflict, threaten, or cause injury, actions that may be corporal, written, or verbal, and injuries that may be corporal, psychological, material, or social. Under Jackman's definition, neither physical force is required to cause injury, nor is injury necessarily physical. Verbal abuse of children, racism, and sexism might well be considered forms of violence, along with advertising that promotes cigarettes, beer, and tattoos. I'm making a big deal about defining violence because some religious practices, animal sacrifice, fasting, maintaining silence, wearing some sort of uniform, appear coercive to outsiders. Yet for insiders, they comprise religious identity, devotion, and ritual. If we stick to the more traditional definitions of violence, we can identify 20 new religions involved in multiple homicides and/or suicides between 1969 and the end of the 20th century. The Canadian sociologist of religion, Stephen Kent, has added 2 more instances to this list, but also expanded the definition of cult violence to include corporal punishment, medical neglect or assault, spousal violence, punitive dietary restrictions, exhausting work regimes, private re-education and punishment programs, sexual assaults, emotional battering, and socio-political terrorism. He concludes by asserting that with a broad definition of violence, quote, the list of violent newer religions is uncountable. It seems to me that a middle ground is needed to differentiate between harmful acts and religious practices. Some of the items on Kent's catalog of violent undertakings pathologize religious commitment. For example, members of the 12 Tribes community spank their children. They claim biblical justification for the use of corporal punishment. But spanking is against the law in Germany, so government agents in Bavaria seized 40 children of tribes members in 2013 and put them in foster care. The group recovered their children after it took several years for them to recover their children, and has since left Germany for the more tolerant Czech Republic. These and other practices rejected by certain societies, but theologically justified in particular religious groups, make defining violence and abuse extremely difficult. This is especially true if we are to subscribe to Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states, as you can read, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change their religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in private or public, to manifest their religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Of course, some claim that those in new religions are brainwashed and therefore have no freedom of thought, and I'll get to brainwashing in a bit. With all this said, it's important to keep in mind that criminal religious movements do exist. The Italian scholar Massimo Introvigne developed this category to, quote, designate religious groups that commit real crimes, such as terrorism, physical violence, pedophilia, and sexual abuse, as opposed to the imaginary crimes of being a cult or practicing brainwashing, unquote. Criminal activity exists in both the oldest and the newest of a variety of religious traditions, in the mainstream and in the minority. I'm using minority here to describe the social location of a particular group rather within a wider society rather than indicating racial, ethnic, or gender identities. Christianity is a minority religion in Iran, but Shia Islam is a minority religion in the United States. So the problem we face is that the categories of abuse or harm may not fall within legal definitions of criminality. For example, spanking your children or going on a water diet. How did we acquire the sphere of all new religions? Certainly, apprehension of religious minorities has occurred throughout history. But between the years 1978 and 2000, 6 major explosions of violence occurred and generated great anxiety about the dangers of cults. The period began in 1978 with the mass murders and suicides in Jonestown, Guyana. More than 900 members of People's Temple died following the murder of a U.S. congressman and 4 members of his party. I generally try to avoid showing dead bodies in the slides, although you'll see a couple. On the left, we see Jim Jones, and on the right, his son Lou and Lou's family. Although no major cult disasters occurred in the 15 years between 1978 and 1993, it's worth mentioning that a satanic panic arose during the 1980s. Child care workers and others were accused of abusing children and performing satanic rituals on animals and humans. Many innocent people were jailed, and lives were ruined on the fabricated accusations of children. The next violent eruption occurred outside Waco, Texas in 1993, when federal agents engaged in a 51-day siege against the Branch Davidians. The siege began with an abortive raid on the group, a breakaway sect of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It ended with the insertion of poison gas and the eruption of a fire in the group's home. In total, 4 federal agents and 82 Branch Davidians died, and we see here David Koresh. The 1990s also saw 3 outbreaks of violence within the Order of the Solar Temple, an esoteric group that included many high-status individuals. Murders and suicides occurred in France, Switzerland, and Quebec, with a death toll of 74. And pictured here is Luc Jouret, one of the leaders. In 1995, the Japanese new religion Aum Shinrikyo mounted a sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway, killing 13 and injuring thousands of others. Aum had previously murdered critics and dissidents, probably many more than the number of persons killed during the Tokyo attack. Shoko Asahara, the leader, along with 6 others, was executed in 2018. In San Diego, California, in 1997, 39 members of the UFO group known as Heaven's Gate committed suicide in order to catch the tail of the comet Hale-Bopp. They wanted to reach what they called the level above human. 2 more class members committed suicide in subsequent years. At the turn of the millennium, approximately 780 members of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God were either murdered or committed suicide in Kanungu, Uganda. The MRTCG was a new religion devoted to the Virgin Mary based on the visions of a female prophet whom we see seated on the right, Credonium Rowindi. And the only equivalent episode of cultic violence that has occurred since 2000 is the Shakahola Forest incident in Kenya. News came out in 2023 that more than 400 members of the Good News International Church were found dead of starvation, strangulation, or unknown causes. The leader, Paul Mackenzie, is shown here in custody. We might say that the period of large-scale cult violence came to an end with the attacks by al-Qaeda jihadists against U.S. targets on September 11th, 2001. Radical Islamists seeking to force the United States out of the Middle East and establish a caliphate under the direction of Osama bin Laden flew passenger airlines into the World Trade Center in New York City and into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. Alert passengers were able to divert a 4th plane from its goal, Washington, D.C., by engaging in a self-sacrificial crash landing. As compared with the 3,000 people who died that day, the number of victims of the 6 major cult events over a 22-year period totaled around 1,920. We can readily see the pitfalls of making broad generalizations about new religions based upon a handful of extreme examples. By using the extraordinary to exemplify the ordinary, we reduce the vast diversity to be found in these groups and movements into a single dangerous stereotype. Even within the cult disasters I just noted, there are salient differences. For example, the Branch Davidians were provoked into retaliatory violence, unlike the other groups discussed. The Heaven's Gate class members committed suicide and harmed no one else. Although a handful of Jonestown residents killed a U.S. congressman and reporters, most of the violence was directed internally. The Solar Temple murders also seemed aimed only at dissidents and unwilling victims within the group. The MRTCG events remain murky, but it appears that both dissidents and committed members, believers, were murdered. Om Shinrikyo is pretty much the outlier. We might well describe it as a terrorist organization. The group was developing weapons of mass destruction to create a new world order which their leader would rule. So we can see that the violence and the justifications for it differ greatly. Catherine Wessinger's typology of millennial movements identifies clear distinctions between various groups. She describes them as fragile, meaning they experience internal weaknesses and pressure from society, assaulted, that is being attacked by state actors or citizens, and revolutionary, that is acting on an ideology that justifies violence. Scholars have come up with a range of theoretical explanations to identify the causes of these catastrophes and thereby understand them and prevent future outbursts. Following the Branch Davidian deaths, NRM scholars Thomas Robbins and Dick Anthony argued that both endogenous and exogenous factors play a role in explosive violence. Endogenous or internal issues belong to the group itself, such as beliefs, practices, leadership, and organization. Exogenous or external factors are those relating to hostility, stigmatization, and persecution experienced at the hands of outsiders. Other scholars developed a theory of cult violence that emphasized the interaction between the group and the surrounding society, which challenge and thwart the group's vision. In their view, violence is not intrinsic, but rather results from encounters between the group and its cultural opponents, namely family members, the news media, and state actors. Finally, still other scholars argue that cultic violence must be understood as a historical, interactive process. The circumstances, the chronology of events, and the interaction between opponents all contribute to what they call a dramatic denouement. That is to say, a final reckoning at which both the group and its opponents defend their respective identities, values, and very existence. So a range of theoretical investigations of violence and NRMs challenges the cult essentialism model by showing how the interaction between outsiders and members of new religions can lead to violent episodes. As opposed to thinking that violence is intrinsic to the marginal religious group, it is latent in the group's engagement with hostile opponents. In this view, cult violence is actually an anomaly, contingent upon the interaction of competing parties. While scholars of NRM in the fields of sociology and history have sought to determine the causes of violence with an eye toward prevention, those in the cult awareness movement remain wedded to the essentialist view. CAM is the designation preferred by those frequently identified as part of the ACM, the anti-cult movement. Sorry for the alphabet soup here. I will be using these terms somewhat interchangeably since the differences are mainly cosmetic rather than substantive. The CAM differentiated itself from the original ACM by dumping the language of brainwashing and by ditching the practice of deprogramming. Brainwashing is also known as thought reform, coercive persuasion, mind control, coordinated programs of coercive influence, behavioral control, exploitative persuasion. Anti-cultists claim brainwashing is the means by which leaders of cults and groups using thought reform processes have taken in and controlled millions of persons to the detriment of their welfare. Brainwashing has been rejected as a defense in multiple court cases. The American Psychological Association abandoned brainwashing language in the 1990s. And by the end of the 20th century, brainwashing had generally fallen out of favor as the explanation for cult membership. If someone's brain is washed, of course it needs to be unwashed or reset, and this occurred during the process of deprogramming, a frequently coercive process to deconvert the cult member through counseling, confinement, physical abuse, and at times kidnapping. Exit counseling replaced deprogramming as the preferred way to persuade family members to leave cults. The situation outside the United States remains quite different, however, where violent and sometimes fatal deprogramming is legally sanctioned, for example, in South Korea and in the People's Republic of China. In an implicit recognition that cult disasters were anomalies, CAM psychologists and counselors working with former group members began to emphasize what they called spiritual abuse. A flexible expression, spiritual abuse defines a range of behaviors, from threatening hell and damnation to controlling life choices, marriage, education, divorce, to utilizing sexual abuse, all in the name of salvation. Spiritual abuse can be defined simply as the use of spiritual authority for one's personal gain. Abusive actions may be directed at the individual's inner faculties that play a crucial role in spiritual development. They may come from persons whose role is to support and guide that individual's spiritual development. Spiritual abuse may include undue power and influence over another's life, or be the serious harm that occurs when one person manipulates and takes advantage of unsuspecting others, especially in a religious setting. Attention turned to the problem of spiritual abuse only in the 1980s and 1990s, when a culture of victims' rights coupled with feminist activism developed. Advocates for women and children credited the accounts given by those who had experienced sexual abuse. In some instances, criminal acts occurred, such as pedophilia and rape. In others, such as the seduction of an adult individual undergoing personal counseling, they did not. So several books published in the 1990s reflect the shift from the brainwashing, deprogramming paradigm that had characterized the ACM during the 1970s and 1980s. The new emphasis hinged on the recovery programs of the cult awareness movement. By the third decade of the 21st century, the language of harm in the form of spiritual abuse had supplanted traditional rhetoric about the violent cult, at least among some scholars, although not with the general public. A recent listing of books on Amazon about spiritual abuse presents two dozen titles. It is crucial to note that most of these and other books that discuss spiritual abuse are addressing mainstream religions rather than cults. The problem of clergy misconduct within Christian denominations is well documented. Scholars have defined clergy malfeasance as the abuse and exploitation, whether sexual, financial, or authoritative, of religious congregants by their trusted leaders. It is, quote, a real, perversive, persistent phenomenon in modern society, end quote, as multiple surveys indicate. Although spiritual abuse is apparently widespread, it does not seem to cause alarm when it occurs in mainstream Christian denominations in the United States. For example, a report released by the Southern Baptist Convention in 2022 included 700 entries from cases describing sexual abuse committed by Southern Baptist ministers between 2000 and 2019. Although critics found the SBC deliberately secretive and remiss, they did not characterize either the denomination itself or its leaders as inherently deviant. These and other instances of clergy malfeasance further demonstrate the essentialized portrayal of new religions by the news media. Violent or criminal acts by members of mainstream religions usually are not attributed to their religious affiliation. In other words, the Southern Baptist Convention is not condemned because some of its pastors have been identified as sexual predators. Malfeasance by religious leaders is not limited to cults. We do not have to look far to find examples of televangelists tearfully confessing their infidelities, denominational leaders engaging in financial fraud, or pastors preaching a prosperity gospel that enriches themselves. The problem of the powerful taking advantage of the vulnerable and using their position for personal gain exists across a range of authority figures in a variety of fields: therapists, medical personnel, counselors, teachers, professors, coaches, law enforcement officials, employers, and many others. Whenever powerful leaders make sexual contact, provide financial advice, or guide people toward their own personal goals, they are violating professional ethics. In some instances, they may be breaking the law. A theory of coercive control has replaced the brainwashing model in the cult awareness movement. Feminist critiques of patriarchy and domination have also contributed to the popularity of this new framing of cultic harm, since women seem to be victimized by spiritual abuse more frequently than men. Legal sanctions against fraud, kidnapping, assault, rape, and torture would seem to cover instances of the harm or violence that occurs within either families or new religions. None exist for the specific crime of coercive control, except in France, where the legislature passed a law in 2001 that made manipulation mentale, pardon my French, Mind control, a misdemeanor. A new anti-cult law in 2024, which passed over strong objection, created the crime of psychological subjection in France. Unlike earlier legislation, this new law does not require the so-called victim of psychological subjection or undue influence to actually engage in harmful acts. Simply belonging to a particular group might be considered damaging. The NXIVM case in the United States, however, shows that legal redress against harmful associations is already available and that additional measures are not necessary. After a federal investigation, Keith Raniere and other leaders of the NXIVM group were charged and tried for a variety of crimes in 2018. In 2019, Raniere was found guilty of all counts against him: racketeering, sex trafficking, conspiracy, forced labor, identity theft, sexual exploitation of a child, and possession of child pornography. In 2020, he was sentenced to 120 years in prison and fined $1.75 million. According to one anti-cult analyst, the verdict was probably the most significant criminal case against a cult leader in recent times. It certainly demonstrates the ways that federal statutes in the United States can be used to deal with criminal religious organizations. Because the courts have not been receptive to theories of brainwashing, mental manipulation, and undue influence, anti-cultists have had to turn to existing state and federal laws. They focus on a number of organizations that they call cults, everything from street gangs to terror cells to multi-level marketing schemes. Yes, we're talking about Mary Kay Cosmetics as a cult. In addition to seeing human trafficking statutes as templates for prosecution, the CAM perceives laws regarding child marriage, immigration, asylum, and predatory alienation as useful methods for fighting cultic harm. Predatory alienation is the process of emotionally distancing children from their parents in custody cases. In short, there's a pretty big toolbox for addressing criminal activity conducted by religious groups. There's a clear difference, however, between criminal acts defined by legislatures and adjudicated by the courts, and coercive persuasion or coercive control, which currently is not a crime in most countries. More serious than legislative efforts to criminalize religious beliefs and behaviors under the guise of protecting individuals from harm are the social control tactics that state actors are currently using against new and minority religions. From issues as small as refusing to recognize the legitimacy of religious groups to as large as genocide, the number of efforts by nation states to limit and suppress the diversity of religious expression is rising. In many countries, members of minority religions face legal restrictions, arrest, imprisonment, torture, and death. Just a few examples: Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, the Church of Almighty God in China, the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification in Japan, and the Church of Scientology in France. In its 2024 report, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom offers ample evidence of current religious persecution. Religious minorities in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq suffer discrimination in employment and education. Meanwhile, the crime of blasphemy is leveled against minority religions in Nigeria, Algeria, and Egypt. China is particularly notorious in regard to the repression of religious minorities. These include Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, Catholic and Protestant Christians, Christian New Religions, and Qigong groups. The U.S. SURF reports that the Chinese government sends Uyghur Muslim children to state-run boarding schools to indoctrinate them in Chinese culture. And more than 1 million Tibetan children have already been separated from their parents in this way. Buddhists and Muslims alike are sent to forced labor camps. Across China, authorities have arrested, and tortured thousands of members of the Church of Almighty God and members of Falun Gong. Some of them have died due to the abuse. The persecution of religious minorities in China is brutal and lethal. Unfortunately, China is not the only country where this is happening. State actors are engaged in systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom abuses, says the former chair of U.S. SURF. These include state-generated religious oppression, repressive theocracies, ethno-religious nationalism, non-state actors, authoritarian government co-optation of majority faith, and the slow erosion of democracy. Sociologist of religion Eileen Barker has observed that when state actors label members of religious groups as cultists, extremists, terrorists, or traitors, they no longer have to treat the group as a religion or its practitioners as covered by the laws protecting religious freedom. Such labels are the ultimate form of essentialization, since they demonize minorities and justify the systematic use of state power to eradicate these presumed threats to the social order. Thus, cult essentialism and the myth of the dangerous cult has very real and extremely severe consequences for members of new and minority religions. On the one hand, we have the assertions of the cult awareness movement that there is a large body of evidence to indicate that some groups harm some people sometimes, and that some groups may be more likely to harm people than other groups. I am deliberately emphasizing Michael Langone's word some because of yes, of course, some could. On the other hand, we have the evidence of human rights workers, journalists, and government observers that state actors are violating the principles of religious freedom enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In fact, many countries are ignoring their own constitutions when it comes to religious liberty. The most abusive governments concern themselves with orthodoxy, right thinking, and punish what they view as the threat of wrong thinking. By essentializing new religions as dangerous cults, we come very close to the brink of the coercive control that we are trying to avoid. Thank you for listening, and Holly, I invite you up for the question and answer, and maybe I don't know what's next. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. That was great.
Thank you.
We have a crowd here, and we also have almost 30 people online, and so I will toggle back and forth between live questions and some questions that came in earlier from people who registered. And also, if you are on the Zoom chat, please feel free to send a message through, and we will try to address your questions there as well.
They want to, okay, never mind.
What we were going to do is, I was going to say the question, then maybe you could repeat the question into
Absolutely.
the Zoom chat. So are there questions here? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I'm just curious if I imagine that you have extensive thoughts on this, but if you could give us sort of a brief account of like what explains this rise in, cultic panic, as it were. Where you sort of give us this really nice kind of historical narrative starting in 1978 to 2000, and what explains the sort of increased speed and violence with which states are reacting.
So the question, as I interpret it, is what explains really the increase in this cultic panic, which seems increasing, especially globally. And as I mentioned in the talk, there's always been fear of the other and fear of heretics and people who disagree with us religiously, in the early Roman Empire, in the rise of Islam, the Reformation, the wars of religion. So we can always find instances where there's fear of the religious other. It seems exacerbated today because of actually the recognition of religious diversity that exists in the world, and that a commitment to a religious ideal or goal that transcends your allegiance to the state or to the society or the culture in which you live is the threat, right? So you cannot be a good citizen if your allegiance is to God or Allah ahead of your neighbors. And I think that especially in the countries that I mentioned at the end of the talk, that's very clearly why they see those particular groups as traitors and treasonous and extremists. We're not quite there in the United States, but I think that there is a sense that if you're not sufficiently patriotic and your religious commitment outweighs your commitment to the nation, you're up for, you're under suspicion.
We're waiting on questions from Zoom, so maybe I'll ask you a couple of the questions that came in from people who registered. First of all, are there differences between monotheist religions and polytheist religions regarding dangerous myths?
So just to repeat, are there differences between monotheistic religions and polytheistic religions regarding dangerous myths? Well, I don't know if I want to call it a myth, but there is a belief that the monotheistic religions are more intolerant of religious diversity than the polytheistic religions. And there might be some historical evidence to back that up. Certainly in the ancient world, polytheism was the norm, right? Everyone had their own god, they prayed to their god, and that's fine. Whereas there were the monotheistic religions were saying, well, no, our religion is correct and your religion is incorrect. So at least in the early Roman Empire, and certainly some instances in the history of Europe, that is the case. But if we look at the polytheism of contemporary Nordic or Norse paganism, some forms of heathenism, kind of ethno-national forms of paganism, they're polytheistic, but I would not say that they're tolerant of religious diversity. So it kind of depends on what, as does everything, what historical time period are we considering?
In the last 20 years, have new religious movements become more popular or less popular?
So in the last 20 years, have new religious movements become more popular or less popular? Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I think if we look at the 1960s counterculture in the US, we see a lot of experimentation with Asian religions, Jesus movement, various forms of Jewish renewal, just a communal living, communal experiments. And so that, according to one scholar, kind of came to a crashing halt with the deaths in Jonestown. And the argument of John R. Hall is that Jonestown pretty much ended communal experiments in the 20th century. I think that might be changing in the 21st century as people, we see the rise of the nuns, right? People who say they have no religious commitment. 25% of people in the United States say that they have no religious affiliation. That's not to say they don't have a belief in a higher power or some sort of spiritual orientation, but they're not religiously affiliated. So I actually think there's a lot of religious experimentation going on globally between paganism, nature religion, nature spirituality, forms of Buddhism, forms of meditation. I mean, who doesn't meditate right today? The New Age appropriates pretty much everything like a vacuum cleaner. And so I find that even though it seems like society is particularly secular, especially in Europe, a little less so in the US, there's like a lot of spirituality kind of informing society. Meditation, Qigong, Tai Chi, yoga, all sorts of things that don't seem religious, but seem spiritual and are attracting, and that continue to attract people.
Go ahead.
How would you apply the interactionist model of new religious movement violence that you mentioned to the Heaven's Gate incident?
So how would I apply the interactionist model to the Heaven's Gate incident? That's a good example of the theory not actually explaining the events, because the only interaction, the interaction was with the celestial event of the Hale-Bopp comet, right? So there was no, as far as I understand it, there was no external pressure on the group. There might have been some parental concern about group members. The group members deliberately videotaped themselves before the death saying, this is something I want to do. I'm looking forward to this event. No children were involved, right? No violence was, taken against children. And so I think that in that instance, the interactionist model does not work. There is another theory, there's like a zillion theories. So the one that I kind of favor in terms of Heaven's Gate, and actually even Order of the Solar Temple and Jonestown, is one from Jim Lewis, which is that the leader of the group is either dying or believes himself to be dying. And rather than have the group go on without him under his leadership, he takes everybody with him. And that's kind of described as familicide in the National Enquirer. And you've seen this headline: father kills family, self, right? He's lost his job. He can't support his family or kids anymore. And so rather than try and think that they can survive without him, he kills the family and then kills himself because he does not think that they can go on without them. And so I think that Jim Lewis's explanation is like Marshall Herff Applewhite believed that he was dying of cancer. Jim Jones believed he was dying of any number of things. And Louis Mambo also thought that he had cancer or something. And so I think in those instances, I kind of like his explanation for what happened. That's not the only explanation, but it's part of what I think might have happened.
We still don't have any questions here, but go ahead.
Can you say more about the category new religious movement? How new does it have to be? Does it have to be small scale? At what point is it different than if it's an offshoot, at what point is it considered an offshoot and not just part of that larger group?
Yeah, so the question is one that has been plaguing scholars for many years. How do you define new religious movement? What do you mean by new? How big does it have to be? So in the first century, Christianity was a sect within Judaism, right? It was a new religion. There have been debates and discussions. One point of view is that the newness must be emphasized, right? That it's a movement comprised of first-generation individuals, Eileen Barker, so that it doesn't exist until those people form it. Another view is that a religion a new religion exists in tension, in conflict with the wider society. And so, by that definition, you could include, Jehovah's Witnesses or even Mormons up to a point in history. So I think that I'm struggling because that's a debate even within the field, at what point, is the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints, is that a cult? I would say no. Is that a new religion? It was in the 19th century, but I would say today it's an established religion. And some of it is like numbers, right? How many people are part of it, right? Is it just a small little group led by a charismatic leader? Is there a global outreach? Is there a missionary or evangelistic kind of attitude. And so I think all those factors go into it. That's why I think one reason that scholars are preferring to use minority religion, because that way it doesn't have to be new. It's basically, as I said, what's the social location of that group? Because, you know, if there are only a few of you, you are already living in tension with your surrounding area.
I'm curious, so with regards to like government legislation that's used to target people of these groups, has there been, particularly in the United States, like over the last 20 years, has there been, like in the case of France, where legislation has been passed that has been used specifically to target members of these groups?
Okay.
The Lukumi decision.
Okay, I'll let Holly answer part of that. So the question is like, what, if any, legislation has existed in the United States that might target specific religious groups? And back in the 1970s and 1980s, especially shortly after Jonestown, a number of state legislatures did in fact try to criminalize brainwashing. Those efforts did not get very far. And there have been court cases where in terms of alienation of affection, conservatorships, and other forms of court cases that have been used by anti-cultists to challenge what they see as the abuses of cults. So Holly has an answer on the Lukumi decision, which she knows more about than I do.
Well, I have a couple of things. First of all, in the late 1980s, there was a case of a group home for men with developmental disabilities. The caregivers were arrested and they were prosecuted, among other things, for mental slavery. And those claims were not pushed forward successfully in the US court, but that case has been used as precedent in other countries to argue for mental slavery, which is really the next generation of brainwashing. But fortunately, in the United States, I think it's 1993, it might be 1994, there was a case in Florida. It's known sometimes as the Lukumi decision. It went all the way to the Supreme Court pertaining to a Santeria group that was practicing animal sacrifice. The county passed an ordinance barring animal sacrifice, but specifically targeting the Santeria community. And the decision basically set in stone in the United States a precedent that you cannot use the law to specifically target a particular religion. And so in other words, you can pass an ordinance, but if it looks like the ordinance is created specifically to go after a faith community or a new religious movement, there's grounds for a court challenge. Are we done? We don't have any questions here. My last question here is, are there healthy cults? If so, what are their features?
Are there healthy cults? What are their features? So yes, they're healthy new religions. The problem is the word cult, because as soon as we say that word, we get all the images that you repeated, like at the beginning of the class. And even though those in the cult awareness movement say there are dangerous cults, but to add the adjective dangerous is really unnecessary, because when we hear cult, we already have made up our mind about the nature of that religion, right? That's bad religion. I mean, we don't call Baptists cultists, right? We don't call Methodists cultists. We don't call Jews cultists. It's only specific groups that we don't like or that we fear. And so I would say, yes, there are many new religions, minority religions, alternative religions, people practicing all sorts of different observances, you know, whether they're Wiccan or Christian, whatever it is. Yes, there are many that are harmless and maybe even beneficial. It's just that the problem is whenever we say cult, we immediately go right down a particular path. And that's why the NRM scholars try to avoid using it. Although I have to say, in my own writing, I'll say I'm going to use cult and NRM interchangeably just because it's too much trouble to kind of try and be a purist about it.
Please.
I noticed that in the whole presentation, there only seemed to be one female leader. Do you have any opinions on like the roles of women in cults or like it seems like the leaders are men.
Okay, yeah, the question is about why were the leaders mainly men? Are there any female cult leaders? And yes, there are. And the one that immediately comes to mind, because they came pretty close to having a devastating event, was Elizabeth Clare Prophet in the Church Universal and Triumphant. And they were preparing for Armageddon and building underground bunkers in Gardnerville, Montana. And they thought there was going to be a nuclear war. And that's a perfect example of the interactionist thing, because they were doing their own thing, but the surrounding community was very afraid of what they were up to. Why? Because they had guns, right? And they're bringing all these guns for self-defense, for when Armageddon comes, you know, they're going to be ready to shoot their way out. And so she was a very important leader, and she comes to mind. And then Mahananda, Sheila, in Rajneeshi, although the leader, Osho, was male, this was a group in Oregon that kind of took over a community in Antelope, Oregon. And like all leaders, they don't do it by themselves, right? They have a cohort of lieutenants. I call it the cadre. My sisters were part of the cadre around Jim Jones. Those are the people who actually do the work, right? The leader might say blah, 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 and the cadre implements it. So in the Rajneeshi group, Mahashiananda was right, she's like this with the leader, and actually was probably making as many decisions as he was about the running of that group. And that also was another group that attempted to poison people in the surrounding area by sprinkling, was it salmonella on the salad bar thing? You might want to rethink about salad bars, but anyway, sprinkling salmonella and some other things. So I think, well, I did mention, yeah, as you know, I mentioned Credonia Mwendy. So I just think there are female leaders, and there are also some scary ones. The Australian woman, is it Jane Byrne? No, what the Australian group? You know, who is that?
Oh, I know some- they're the something Christians, Jesus Christians?
No, there's a group in Australia, and the name of the leader.
People who are blue.
Yeah.
Yeah, the blue people.
Well, they all had blonde hair. Remember that? Anyway, there's a woman in Australia who also was actually a very abusive cult leader. So let's not let women off the hook. Women can just be just as mean as men. They just have not yet successfully, you know, enacted their own cult disaster. But not for lack of trying.
On that, is there anything gendered in the cult awareness?
Yes, there is, because women are seen as victims. In other words, women have been victimized disproportionately. Of course, part of that is, and this is say, in the practice of some sort of tantric group or Misa, Sex Magic group, you know, is sexual intercourse or some sort of sexual practice, is that abuse of women if you agree to it? And that's what's at issue. And that's why the anti-cultists want to say, well, there's coercive control. They've been manipulated into consent. I have a problem with that viewpoint because it denies agency to the victims. I don't want to say that women were not victimized, but just to quote a scholar, Mary Maga wrote an analysis of women leaders in People's Temple, and she said that women gained power in People's Temple by sleeping with Jim Jones.
True, I agree with that.
That they had more access to, they were in positions of power that far outweighed anything a 25-year-old woman could have done in the 1970s. But I just read this very day, I got an email from InfoCult, which is a cult awareness group based in Canada. So this is a program, Victims and Survivors of Crime Week, starts May 11th to 17th. And the slogan, working together to prevent gender-based and sexual violence in cultic settings. And I don't want to sound like I'm making fun of this. I'm not. But I'm saying that the focus has shifted from kind of brainwashing to it's about sexual abuse. And there's multiple explanations for that. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question though. But...
Others here? Go ahead, please.
You talked about the difference in the way we treat abuse committed by mainstream clergy versus abuse by cult leaders. But might it not be useful to think about a cult leader who says, well, all women in the group have to have sex with me or be married to me because I'm a Jew, which is, I think, kind of different from like a mainstream Protestant pastor, Catholic priest, not to be able to say that.
Right. So the question is really the difference between a cult leader engaging in sex and like a mainstream pastor is theological, right? That's what the question is about. And you're right. The cult leader or religious leader is giving a theological explanation for why they should have sex. Right? It's because I'm Jesus and therefore you want to have sex with me. Or as probably happens more frequently, it's just you are close to a powerful person. You engage in power and share that power when you engage in sex with that person. And that happens in all kinds of groups, right? Where the leader, whoever that leader is, and male or female, to gain power, you engage in sex, you share in that power. And it's true that in traditional religions, the religious leader, the clergy person, doesn't have the same theological justification for engaging in sexual activity. Although if you read some of the literature, it's pretty scary about the priest engaging in pedophilia with the kid saying, I'm doing this to purge you of your sin. So it can happen, but I think that I would agree with you that there's not the same theological justification or explanation for it. But at the same time, we always have to remember that if someone's powerful and we want to share in that power, we do things that we might not otherwise do. Oh.
Questions. So I'll ask a question because it came up twice on this list. Does the presence of tax exempt status in the US do anything to the relative number of new religious movements or cults here compared to other countries?
Okay, so yes, the question is about does tax status of religious tax exemptions create a difference in US the existence of new religions in the US? Yes, because the US historically, it has religious voluntarism, that's what it's called. In other words, anybody can start a religion, and if the IRS says you're a religion, that's all you need, right? You earn that or by filing the appropriate paperwork, and the IRS says you're a religion. I mean, we don't have any place where you apply, as in some countries, whereas in Europe, they have state-sponsored religion. The U.S. Constitution says there shall be no establishment of religion in the First Amendment, meaning we're not going to have a state church. We're not going to give any money to any religion. That's being challenged like all over the place. But that's what the First Amendment to the Constitution says. So yes, the situation in the U.S., not just because of the IRS, but also just because of our history of religious voluntarism, is like, yes, the U.S. is like much more religious than Europe, and they kind of think we're wacky. Well, maybe we are because of that, but it is definitely, there are historical reasons for that as well as financial.
So I'll ask a question because this is something I wonder about myself sometimes. Given that all religions and sectors of society can potentially lead to negative outcomes or consequences, should there be oversights, either internal or external, over both established and new religious movements? And is such oversight feasible or ethical? And this is a good question, given the fact that over the past, I think, 3 days, the ministerial exception for clergy has been changed in the state of Washington. So there is more oversight here than in many other parts of the US.
Right. So the question is, should we have more oversight of religious groups? I don't know. I mean, I tend to think not, but I'm not an absolutist when it comes to First Amendment privileges, either free exercise, well, actually, in a way I am, free exercise or no non-establishment, right? Non-establishment means no public money to religious groups. That's my position as an absolutist on that. Free exercise, I'm pretty open to almost anything except for, rape, pedophilia, and things that you would expect. I'm concerned about oversight because now you are attempting to change or manage the internal affairs of a religious group. And that's not the same. We have statutes that require financial oversight of companies, right? You file your tax return, you do an audit, and so on. But nobody really checks business practices unless there's something skanky about them. And the fact is, why you could use those about religions as businesses. So I guess I'm kind of arguing both sides of the fence. We already have statutes in place that can be used to investigate, religious groups that have questionable practices, whether it's financial or sexual abuse or, taking people's money and so on. We have those in place. I guess I don't think we need an additional bureaucratic entity that's just targeting religion. That scares me.
Please.
So would you say that because we have the statutes in place, it's less of an implementation of oversight and more of an adherence to actually doing it? In the case of like company oversights, we have them. I think a lot of people in this room can think of a couple companies that perhaps are not the most ethical about how they do things and are not persecuted even though they could be.
Yeah, so the question is, right, if we have the statutes, what's going on? Why aren't they being implemented or used? And that requires political will to do the job that has been specified. And so at certain times in US history, certainly, there were watchdog organizations for all sorts of financial and other institutions. And those have been eroded over the last several decades, not just, in the 21st century. Those started, the erosion of that started really back in the 80s or so. So we would have to have the will, the political will, to do what you're talking about in a range of different venues, whether it's business or securities or religious groups. But usually, at least in the US, the religious groups have been kind of hands off. So, but if someone, we get letters, we get emails, a lot of emails because of a website we run, and frequently they're, my daughter's in a cult, what should I do? And I usually refer them to kind of cult awareness groups for counseling and for more advice. But I say, if you think that there's anything criminal going on, is your daughter sexually abused? Is, this happened, has money, is she enslaved? In other words, are there criminal things? Then you need to report that to the local law enforcement. And so if people have these concerns, they need to report them. But the flip side of that is it's hard to investigate religious groups because they tend to be off limits, right?
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
I just sort of wanted, I discovered this last year because I was looking for this statistic. How much embezzlement and corruption exists in established religions? And it turns out that in the United States and also globally, in recent surveys, it looks like something between 30 and 40% of Christian churches in the US and pretty much around the world admit to having some type of financial scandal or embezzlement. And so I guess just to sort of build on the question that you asked, I would say it may be that there needs to be oversight, but the oversight needs to be done in a way that is not targeting for the basis of beliefs or social standing in the community, but really on the basis of bad behavior. And there's more than lots of bad behavior in established religions right now. Please.
So, could one make the claim that a lot of the issues we run into with that lack of consistency is in the hands of the, I'll just say, ineptitude of our current law enforcement and procedures around that?
So the question is law enforcement inept? Is that why, you know, people are getting away with stuff? I don't know. I don't think it's ineptness. I think it's, you know, concern about intervening in religious affairs, number one, and also a lack of personnel to do it, a lack possibly, I'd use the word of education about the nature of religion. People are ignorant about religion, right? Around the world, people know their own religion, but they don't understand it. Here's a plug for your department, you know, in the way that people who study religion understand it, right? That's a different way of thinking about religion. But I want to go back to like my concluding message, which is like the state intervention and oppression of religious groups based on beliefs or the perception that they're dangerous. That to me is always in the back of my mind when there's any kind of thought of investigating religion, for almost any reason, because you can shut something down very quickly if you want to.
Please.
Do scholars of minority religions, such as yourself, also study groups that are not religious but have been considered cults, especially by the anti-cult movement? And what is different about the way that those groups are studied?
Okay, so the question is like, are groups that are not religious, but that are seen as as cults by the anti-cult movement, are they studied by traditional NRM scholars? Is that kind of correctly?
It depends on the scholar.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer. It depends on the scholar. But I think that, you know, a lot of groups have cult-like behavior. And so I would say that there are scholars, actually, the organizational management scholars are the ones who are kind of doing studies like that rather than religious studies scholars, because there's kind of a large body of literature in you know, building teams and organizing groups and getting people to do what you want, right? That's all that manipulation. They don't call, you know, the good leader, the good business leader is the person who gets you to do what they want and you think you thought of it. That's what they teach at Wharton. So that literature, I think, it comes out, that those studies are not so much being done, at least by the NRM scholars, but the people in the other group, let's call them the cult awareness movement, they're studying all kinds of groups, and it kind of, they've changed the title of their journal to the Journal of Coercion, Abuse, and Manipulation. So that way they don't have to deal with religion, right? It can be any kind of group that is being studied that uses coercion, abuse, or manipulation to get its goal, to achieve its goals.
Can we ask one more question from here?
What? Okay. What?
Okay. It says, I took a class last year focusing on state-sponsored meddling violence against political groups in the United States during the 60s to 80s. Do you know if there's any connection between the United States' approach to what they deemed as cults after Jonestown and their targeting of various political groups?
Right, okay, so basically the targeting of particular political groups in the 60s and 70s by US federal investigators, and is that happening today? Is that the
Do you have any
question?
comments? Is there a relationship between how new religions have been handled and political groups?
Well, certainly the people in People's Temple were convinced that they were spied upon. And there were CIA agents in Guyana who worked for the US Embassy, who were maintaining contact and so on with members of residents of Jonestown. And so I would not be surprised if there were certain other groups that might well have been spied upon. I kind of don't want to get too paranoid about the whole thing. But, you know, if the practice is to be concerned about groups that are perceived as deviant, as threatening, as politically challenging the status quo, then I always think that those groups are in fact targeted. In fact, when I first heard about the Jonestown deaths, I thought that the CIA had done it. That was like, oh, that was who did it. And so I've since come to reject that view, but that was the climate back then. And so it seems entirely possible that well, actually, I can tell you that a couple of CISPEACE, the group, it was a religious group organized against the atrocities in El Salvador in the 1980s. That was spied upon. There were some other groups. They were religious in orientation, but had a political agenda. So I think that has happened and probably continues to happen. Is this a lot? When you put that in?
Why did you end your timeline with the Jonestown mass suicide, rather than the Tate LaBianca?
All right. Yes. You know, one of the list of the 22, you know, deaths between 1969 and 2000, that includes the Manson family murders. I don't consider that group a cult. I consider that a criminal religious organization. And so when I think of a new religion, that does not fit the bill. Yes, there's a charismatic leader, but there wasn't any theological or transcendent goal, right? It was, in fact, there was a slogan, and I cannot repeat it in public, but it just to me does not qualify as a religion. But Gordon and David, so two scholars started with the Manson family murders. Yep.
It's a point of debate in our field. So,
Shall we stop?
last question.
Yeah.
Anybody?
Okay, last question.
Last question. Please go ahead.
Based on what you said earlier, I think there have been some examples of cases where new religious movements end up getting sort of enmeshed with state power. Like, for example, I think Jonestown or the People's Temple prior to leaving for Guyana, they had connections with California. I think there have been accusations of Scientology colluding with governments. The assassination of Shinzo Abe was motivated by a belief that the Shinzo Abe and other members of the Japanese government were colluding with Asian church and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is basically, what about the new religions that seem to have co-opted state power? And yes, I think that there are examples. So People's Temple in San Francisco had connections with San Francisco leadership, and some believe that it was actually to the detriment of free elections. I don't believe that's true, but some people argue that. I think that actually Unification Church, Reverend Moon attempted to influence U.S. politics, was friends with Richard Nixon, and so on. I don't think that the assassination of the Japanese prime minister, it was the the assassin claimed that his mother had been, cheated out of money 20 years earlier, but he didn't commit the assassination until 20 years later. And so that one, I think is kind of dubious in terms of any kind of influence of the Unification Church having in Japanese politics. It did have an influence, but not in terms of the
They
assassination.
gave money to everybody.
Oh, well, they gave, okay. And Scientology is its own, that's like, yeah, that's hard to categorize as to who they give money to. They basically bankrupted the Cult Awareness Network and got that name in their papers. So I wanted to end on a stronger note, which is to thank you all for all your questions and your attention, and it was a pleasure to be here. So best wishes in your studies, and have a nice summer vacation when it comes. Thank you.